Welcome. My name is Kim Bojorquez, and I'm the Latino Communities Reporter for the Sacramento Bee and a Report for America Corps member. In 1990, Latinos accounted for nearly a quarter of the state population. Today, the landscape has changed, and California is home to an estimated 14 million Latinos and represent nearly 39% of the population. The Sacramento Bee, with support from the Solutions Journalism Network, conducted an analysis looking at the racial representation of Sacramento County city councils and school boards up to the state legislature. And while Latinos have made gains in the state legislature and in Sacramento County's public school boards, our analysis shows municipal seats in Sacramento County do not reflect the community. Today, we've organized a panel to discuss the barriers that Latino candidates face while campaigning, the policies that helped put more Latinos in office, and what you can do as a voter. We have gathered questions from community members and Sacramento Bee readers for our panelists. We have added your questions throughout each segment. We will have 3 segments today: campaigning, voting, and representation in that order. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our readers and viewers for joining us for this important discussion. Now, I'd like to introduce my co-host. My co-host for this panel is veteran Sacramento Bee opinion columnist Marcos BRETON. He will now introduce our panelists by title.
Thank you, Kim. It's a pleasure to be here, and we have a distinguished panel of experts. And we begin with Senator Maria Elena DURAZO, a Los Angeles State Senator. Laura Gomez is a law professor at UCLA School of Law. Luis Alvarado is a political consultant and co-founder of Grow Elect. Mindy Romero is the founder of the USC's Center for Inclusive Democracy. And Robert Rubin has been a civil rights attorney for more than 40 years. Our first segment will be on campaigning, and I will pass it back to Kim Bojorquez.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome Senator Maria Elena DURAZO, who will kick off our first segment on campaigning. Senator, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kim.
You're the daughter of Mexican immigrants who worked as farm workers in California and Oregon. How did that impact your decision to become an organizer in California's labor movement?
Well, first of all, I never had any intentions of running for office. I think like many who end up running for office. My life is an open book. As you said, being a migrant farm worker myself, alongside my 8 siblings and parents, I had a real impact on me in terms of what I wanted to become, what I wanted to do in life, not necessarily a specific position. I knew that it was wrong that we worked so many hours every single day and we didn't have anything to show for it. We still lived in absolute poverty. Many times we didn't have a roof over our head. My parents, did the best that they could, never gave up on on anybody, anything. And yet we still continued to live in complete poverty. My father, luckily, he believed in education, so he worked real hard and pushed us in that direction. But there's no doubt that that had everything to do with my decision to run for office, public office. I had run for office as a union president of the hotel and restaurant workers, but this definitely was a whole different area for me personally. I had helped many get elected. I'd worked on many, many campaigns, did everything I could, but to run myself was a very unique experience that I had never had. But what kept me thinking about it was what kinds of decisions lawmakers face. What can they do? The power that they have to impact our lives. I knew it in helping others get elected. Now I had to apply it to myself. And the other thing is I really wanted to see more women. And that was something that I had to face. If I wanted to see more women, then I had to do something about it myself.
And when you campaigned to run for your state Senate seat, what were the kinds of barriers you faced as a Latina candidate?
Well, let me just say first the flip side, which is what I think I had going for me. And that was, again, a life of being alongside hotel housekeepers. and their courage, and janitors and construction workers and farm workers. This is what I had going for me. I knew that they and me, and working with them and helping them find their courage was also a challenge to me. Did I have the courage to do something different? So they really had tremendous influence. And besides that, I was going to run on what was very public. I mean, I've been arrested 23 times. You know, I have a very public life already. There's pretty much nothing anybody could find that isn't known. But I guess the first obstacle was myself. Was I willing to do something completely different on a personal level than what I had ever done before? And was I up for that challenge to go from being a national labor leader with a position, all the positions I had leading up to that, very high level stature across the country, to go to representing a district of 1 of 40 in the state legislature? Was I willing to do that, give it my all, and really believe in it? And I think what definitely pushed me over the edge was the fact that Donald Trump was elected as president of this country. And it scared me to think what he was capable of doing and impacting a state like California and the whole nation. So frankly, that's what tipped me over, and I decided to run. But again, I think it was the personal commitment and decision that was the obstacle I had to face.
And how did those life experiences influence the legislation you proposed when it comes to providing protections for immigrant workers?
Well, as you said, you know, immigrants are a very critical part of California. They now have the title of essential workers, but they need to be treated as essential workers, not just the title of what they do for us, but what do we do for them? How do we treat them? And not giving them a title isn't good enough. And so my life experience of being a farm worker myself, knowing what it's like not to have food, knowing what it's like, you know, to work so many hours, to go from town to town, a different school every year, and yet still try to be focused on education as, you know, the number one goal. So that have an impact. Hotel housekeepers who have backbreaking work every single day, and they commit so much to a very prosperous industry, that had a big influence on me. You know, our kids getting the education that they deserve? We pay taxes. Immigrant families pay taxes. Immigrant families are very mixed status families. So it's not like here's an undocumented family and then here's a all citizen family. 65, 70% of undocumented are in mixed status families. So everything that we do in our decisions is impacting them. So everything in my life was, and I also saw that the future of the state, not just what we were going through, what we go through at the time, but thinking about the future. I thought about my future, my kids, my grandkids, and that's what our communities are looking for too. They just don't want to stay where they're at. So I got exposed in my life to extraordinary people like these construction workers and their unions and these apprenticeship programs that prepare them for incredible careers. And so that also gave me a glimpse as to what could be. And that definitely helps to shape the kind of legislation, not only that I support, but that I introduce.
Thank you. And we have a reader question from Ashik of Riverside County. If the democratic system is of the people, by the people, and for the people, then why is the question who holds the power?
Well, I think in the process of introducing legislation, there's power in introducing legislation. There's power in voting for that legislation. There's power in garnering support of other legislators so you can get the legislation approved and passed and then sent to the governor. There's power in that. Now, I have grown up to believe that that's not real power, that's temporary. And what really matters is our legislation, is what we're doing really connected to on the ground. It's got to be that sort of back and forth. And so are all the people that I care about, the hardworking men and women, are they connected? When they vote, do they see that it translates into something for them, not into something that a greedy, elected official could get? But does it translate into something for them? And I do believe that's where the real power is. If I try to pass legislation that is not connected to organizing on the ground and the grassroots level, I'm sort of, okay, wondering and praying, will it work? Will I get the support I need and the votes I need? But when I'm connected to people on the ground who fight for these issues every single day, I hope to give them power. I welcome them. For example, when we have hearings, I open the door, I go down and welcome them. I used to be able to do more of that, but I want them to feel that that Capitol building is theirs. They're welcome. They're not treated as second-class citizens. I want to hear from them. I do my best to give them their rightful place. So, power is, for me, power is them. Now, many times our voters don't believe that they have the power, but I have seen it. It's not numbers, it's who votes. It's how we organize that vote and how we make it work for us and make the changes that we need. Essential workers need to be really treated with enormous respect, which means they should get the PPE, which means that they should get paid when they're ill. They shouldn't have to choose between going to work and starving. The safety net should cover everybody. And when we talk about climate change and the fires, let's talk about climate change when it comes to contamination in our communities of color. When we talk about the green, the new green economy, let's talk about getting people off of minimum wage in the solar industry and into good paying jobs in the solar industry. So there's so much that we could do and still left to do to make our state great, but give people power at the level that they deserve it.
And our analysis found that Latinos represent about 22% of the California legislature. What do you believe needs to happen for there to be a proportional racial representation in the legislature?
I'm so glad you brought that up, Kim, because we do need to have a respect for diversity. We use that term very loosely. And if it's going to mean anything, whether it's at the corporate level, the political level, no matter where, it really has to be intentional. We can't just keep saying we believe in diversity, but instead of, but 50 to 60% of the COVID positive cases are Latino. That's not the kind of diversity I'm looking for. I'm talking about, diversity that really matters. And that's intentional. You have to make a decision based on how we equalize the communities in our state. And I don't think we've been as intentionally we should be. As vice chair of the Latino caucus, that's how we have done it over the years. And I'm grateful to those who formed the Latino caucus, because it wasn't until the 60s when a Latino was even elected to the state legislature. So it's been several decades of growing, and that means intentional about raising money, intentional about who's running, intentional about what they bring, what kind of strength and values they bring to the state legislature. I don't want just Latino for the sakes of Latino. They should be people who really believe in our community. So we've got to be deliberate, intentional. We have to have a seat at the table where decisions are made. We have to have the courage to stand up and speak out on the issues, and not just wait to be talked to. We have to assert these issues: wages, healthcare, retirement. All these things are things that we have to speak about. It's not just numbers that will decide our future and decide our power. Otherwise, we would have been our numbers would have been reflected in Sacramento. It's also, how do we make sure that we will be supporting our communities in a very tangible, very real way?
Thank you. And Senator, this is the last question I have for you. Latino and immigrant communities in California have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. What healthcare or economic policy plans do you plan to introduce next year to address those issues?
Well, unfortunately, the bill that I've tried in both sessions was to expand Medi-Cal to undocumented. It wasn't until the era of Pete Wilson and Prop 187 that undocumented have been excluded from the coverage of healthcare. And I think it's essential. If all people would have had healthcare regardless of their immigration status, it would have been part of being able to fight back against the pandemic. And so I intend to continue to raise the issue of Medi-Cal expansion to all, regardless of immigration status. I also think that in our workplaces, we have to be much stronger about enforcing workplace health and safety. We know, for example, there's the Foster Farms issue facility in Livingston, where hundreds of workers were found positive. 8 or 9 workers died because the facility would not respect the county orders. We have an apparel company in LA, again, 300 to 400 positive cases. They're putting up cardboard, to separate people. So I think those things, and also finally is housing. The overcrowded housing in which many people have to live in does not lend itself for something, especially a crisis like the pandemic. So we have to deal with that. It all comes down to, are all these men and women getting the kind of pay that they deserve so that they don't have to live in poverty, so that they could fight back, so that maybe the work that they do is more respected. And we have to deal with the digital divide. The digital divide is leading many to, it's a white upper, middle class people who get to do the work at home, but that hard work in restaurants or garment or other jobs, essential jobs, farm workers, they don't get to do it from home, but their kids ought to be able to look forward to a different life. So it is about healthcare, but there's a number of things that are connected to healthcare, and we can't wait for a pandemic to do something about it. We've got to do it before, during, and after.
Thank you for your insights, Senator. Marcos will now introduce our next segment.
Thank you, Kim. With us today are Mindy Romero and Robert Rubin, 2 distinguished leaders in the fight to increase voter participation. Mindy runs the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC, and Robert has been a civil rights attorney for many years. Mindy, let's begin with you. You're a pioneer in using data to attack inequality in voting. Please tell us about your upbringing in Modesto and how you noticed inequality in your own neighborhood and the impact it had on your decision to dedicate your professional career to the cause of increasing access to voting.
Well, I think we've already heard today, and I suspect from all of the panelists, right, there's something in our own personal lives that really motivated us, that drives us today, motivated us to do the work that we do, and that still drives us today. And so for me, it was simply when I was a kid, just growing up and seeing the conditions that were around me, the inequality that was present in my community. I grew up in Modesto, and the side of town that I was on, the roads, for everything, the schools, to the pollution in the air, the smells from the local plants. made it a challenge. It's a wonderful community, but obviously, it was quite obvious that obviously it was clear to all of us that that our community wasn't kept up and didn't have the same services and resources as other neighborhoods in town did. And that instills a sense of, kids really have a strong sense of fairness and a sense of when things don't feel right. And for me, that was the case. And I think it informed really everything about me growing up, wanting to understand why that could be, who made these decisions, elected officials and others. Why was this okay? Of course, it's quite a complicated story to that not any one elected official is responsible for, but still, it's a large political system. Understanding who makes those decisions, who picks those decision makers, and then really, it's striking. And when I first learned that, my community didn't have a very large voice in the election process. And so it just really made me commit myself to understanding that puzzle. The communities that need the largest voice often don't have as much of a voice, right? And it makes a real difference in the quality of life in their communities on the ground for their kids, right? And for their life chances. And so that's just informed my work going forward and trying to still figure out that puzzle. Even getting a PhD years later and understanding the research that's out there, it still doesn't sit right with so many of us that do research in this field, trying to understand how the research can help change those patterns.
And we will unpack that in a moment. First, let's bring in Mr. Rubin. Let's begin, Mr. Rubin, by exploding a myth that the battle for voting rights was won back in the 1960s during the Civil Rights era. In 2013, a conservative majority of the U.S. Supreme Court gutted Section 5 of the Federal Voting Rights Act. You were present as a spectator in the court that day when this happened. Can you tell us why Section 5 was important and what was it like to be in the court that day?
I'd be happy to. I did want to just quickly mention that I was pleased to hear Mindy talk about the Modesto situation, because there are actually two cases that I'm very proud of that my office at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights brought on behalf of Latino residents in Modesto who were denied the right to vote through a vote dilution system, an at-large system that prevented them from electing candidates of their choice, and a municipal services suit that challenged the disparity in services that are being made available to the Latino community. So I just did want to point that out, and we're happy to join forces on those issues as well as the issues that we're going to talk about here in this segment. So many people feel that voting rights protections are really a relic of the Deep South, and that things like literacy tests and poll taxes are just explicit discriminatory devices that keep blacks from voting. But they're nothing that we need to worry about here in the enlightened North. Well, here, voting rights are under attack now, today, in California, as conservatives use the cover of unsubstantiated fraud charges to deny the right to vote and dilute the right to vote of communities of color. And the role of race is very prominent in this area. In many states, it was commonplace for governments to make last-minute changes in voting practices on the eve of an election. And so, for example, under various provisions of the law, a city would seek to change a voting place, the site of a voting booth, from one site to another. But they would move it from a neighborhood that, for example, was a predominantly black neighborhood, and they would move it into a neighborhood that was home to the Ku Klux Klan. And the people would have to challenge that voting in order to get protection from it. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was enacted in 1965 to prevent just that type of situation. And what it did is that it shifted the burden of proof from the target of the discrimination to the discrimination. That is, that the individual or the community that was targeted for discrimination would have to go into court and seek relief in order to get protection from it. But with the Section 5 enactment in 1965, it shifted that burden, and it required the big target, the perpetrator of the discrimination, to get relief from the Department of Justice before the change could go into effect. They would need prior approval from the Department of Justice, given the history of discrimination in that particular city or state. And so when the court invalidated Section 5 in the Shelby County decision in 2013, it acted as if it was writing on a clean slate of congenial race relations. I mean, can anybody claim, certainly when viewed in today's eruption of racial violence and racist activity, that we're living in a post-racial society, that race doesn't matter? Well, I attended the oral argument, as you pointed out, in the Shelby County case, and I recognized John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, sitting nearby. When Justice Lee carried the vote as quote-unquote perpetration of racial entitlement, you could see the pain on John Lewis's face, a man who almost died in defending the right to vote. The court kept talking about a post-racial society in which protection against racially discriminatory devices had supposedly outlived their purpose and can now be so easily discarded. Well, this is an important point to note. Judges responsible for decisions so profoundly impacting society must not only be aware of and sensitive to prevailing racial sentiments, but these sensibilities, as much as perspectives on the law, must guide their judicial decision-making. Otherwise, we're operating in a complete societal vacuum. And these factors must be taken into account as courts make decisions. And certainly as we contemplate the nomination of a new Supreme Court justice, those factors have got to be taken into account if we're going to have a Supreme Court or any court that is going to be reflective of the diversity that society now includes.
Thank you, Mr. Rubin. We'll drill down on the specifics in a moment. But Mindy, I want to ask you about why the data for communities of color used to be so poor. What were some of the glaring gaps in the data, and how did those gaps contribute to a lack of inclusive democracy in voting?
Important question. Well, first I'll say that the data overall still is poor. Often when we see polls, the things that are really easily accessible, right, in the immediate, when we're talking about elections, they either don't include Latinos or communities of color, period, or if they do, the sample sizes are very low. They aren't necessarily presented in a responsible manner, right, and people take those numbers and run with them. So just backing up, so for, kind of the reasons why we're talking about research, aside from like polls generated by news organizations or by campaigns. First there's the lens question. So not having very many Latinos or very many people of color, period, in academia, people look at questions around political participation, questions in political science and political sociology through a lens, and they often historically haven't included the asking questions that get at the lived experiences, life experiences of communities of color, and they're not setting up structuring if they're doing a survey or any type of, whatever the methodology is, they're not necessarily setting it up in a way that they're going to get a representative sample or a kind of an accurate picture as best they can with that research. So things have evolved, and we have better and better approaches in terms of research, in terms of methodology. But I think that lens, when you think about norms, how we're all trained as researchers, we kind of continue those norms. And that's, still today. When you're addressing past research and building on past research, that's still there. And I think, probably those two main aspects, but also we just have limitations in the data that's available to us. Just funding large enough sample sizes, large enough studies that or specific studies that are specific to the Latino community or communities of color, or to really in depth, right, get at an issue or research question, as opposed to these broad generalizable things that often fall short of speaking and being representative of the Latino community.
And just a quick follow-up to that, and I'll get to Mr. Rubin in a moment. What are some of the obstacles that remain because I'm in year 30 of my journalism career, and for the length of my career, I have been told as a journalist, the Latino vote is the quote sleeping giant unquote, and why don't more Latinos vote? And what I've found as my career has gone on is that there are legitimate barriers to increasing participation. Really quickly, can you illustrate one or two of them for us in terms of what that it's not all on the voters themselves, right? There are the processes are not fully developed to be able to have more participation.
And it shouldn't be on the voters. We're only established we are the only established democracy in the world that puts the responsibility of registration on the voter. And that disproportionately impacts the Latino community and other underrepresented groups. So in the sleeping giant way, we shouldn't be using that, even though sometimes we have to address it and respond to it. But it also is part of a larger set of kind of labels that serve to marginalize and suppress the vote, right? Because essentially you're blaming Latinos for low turnout numbers. And yes, there are lots of reasons why Latinos turn out in lower numbers. That is consistent, but there are barriers like, for instance, being left out of campaigns. Latinos even registered election year after election year. We have lots of research that shows us that they're much less likely to get contacted by a campaign or a candidate asked to vote. History of marginalization, it's having to prove, make the case to Latino voters why they should vote and be part of a system that, if they look around, often still marginalizes them. The list could go on, and you said just really quickly, but breaking that narrative of blaming Latinos for their low levels of participation, logically, reasonably, unfortunately, there are lots of reasons for it. And those are what we should be addressing and working to break down, to make it easier for Latinos to participate and be represented.
So some of these things are intentional, which is why I want to bring Mr. Rubin back in now. So Mr. Rubin, we hear a lot, in some cases from the Oval Office, claims of alleged fraud in voting. How have those claims been used as justifications to suppress voting?
Very effectively, unfortunately. The claims of fraud, first off, can be dismissed as wholly unsubstantiated. As Mindy could probably tell you, she can look for all the data that there might be, and she wouldn't find anything because there's nothing there. It just doesn't exist. But the government has used the claims of fraud to chill the interest of voters, including Latino voters. A perfect example is the photo ID requirements. They've chilled the interest of many potential voters who don't possess driver's licenses or passports. And the courts have approved many such restrictions, reasoning that they impose minimal burdens on workers. They asked the question, the judge, why is it so difficult for a poor person to get a driver's license? Well, that poor person has never even contemplated owning a car, so that they wouldn't have any need for a driver's license. Why is it so difficult for a poor person who's never even contemplated international travel to produce a passport? Or an elderly person who doesn't drive to produce a driver's license? I mean, there's this air of unreality that translates into laws that erode the public's confidence in preserving the right to vote. Now, photo ID requirements might not sound very pernicious. The manner in which they are enforced can produce significant discriminatory impacts. For example, in Texas, in order to register to vote, you've got to produce photo ID. Well, what qualifies as photo ID? You say, well, what's the big deal about photo ID? It's just applied to everybody equally. Well, in Texas, gun licenses are acceptable photo ID. Student identification cards are not. So you tell me how that's going to play out. So let's be clear. Photo ID requirements chill the right to vote, the same as poll taxes act to suppress the vote. And in fact, photo ID is a form of the poll tax because it requires funds to pay for the fees that one would have to produce for obtaining the ID. And the fraud issue is really just something that's got to be addressed because it's a cover. It's used to attack voting rights when really what we're talking about is race and political power. And the Republicans are very clear about this. They don't want everybody to vote. When people say, well, why are you chilling people's interest to vote? Don't you want more people to vote? They say, no, we don't want more people to vote, because the more people that vote, the less percentages are going to be in our favor. They know who the people who are disenfranchised are, and they know what their political inclinations are, and they're not inclined to vote Republican. So the fact that they're excluding them is very much in their interest. They're explicitly interested in chilling those people's votes. And so it's important thing that the Republicans are very clear about it too. The former head of the Heritage Foundation explicitly said, "We don't want more people in the voting booths. We don't need more people in the voting booths. We've got all the right people that we want in the voting booths." And Trump himself recently expressed that precise sentiment about the need for controlling the number of people who get in the voting booth. And there's at least 7 states that have been doing this, and around mail-in ballots, and there's no fraud. So they've been asked to put up, but they don't, and they still don't shut up, because that's all we hear out of them is fraud. And the only fraud that's been committed is the kind of candidates that the Republicans are foisting on society.
Thank you, Mr. Rubin. So, of course, this will have to be the last question for Mindy. Let's talk about the work that you're doing right now in terms of dealing with, or you've devised a section of your website where people can really target where they can vote. In the 2 minutes that we have left, can you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, we have lots of research and data on our website, but I think you're specifically talking about our voting location citing tool, yeah, which started here in California. We have now just completed our 10th state. We've been expanding across the country. It's really a tool for both election officials and advocacy and community groups. You can go to a state in California. You can find your county. You can find data. Specifically, we've modeled out suggested voting locations for counties that are still seeking to place equitably and accessibly their voting locations, their polling places and vote centers. And you can also on the tool get a whole bunch of information specific to that community that you can use in voter outreach and education. Community groups can use, or people that are just plain interested and want to know about their community. They'll get information on eligible non-registered voter rates down to the census tract level, vote by mail rates, population data for Latinos, for African Americans, for whites, for Asian Americans, and so forth. So a lot of data that can be used in lots of different ways for people this election and going forward.
And Mindy, can you give people the website?
Yeah, easiest way is just go to our main website, cid.usc.edu, cid.usc.edu, and just click the top where it says citing tool. Can't miss it. And then find your state, find your county, and let us know if you have any questions.
Tremendous. Thank you both for your important work and for participating in this panel today. We will carry on now with our segment on representation. And with that, I'll pass it back to Kim Bojorquez. Kim?
Thank you, Marcos. Our final segment will focus on representation with political consultant Luis Alvarado and UCLA law professor Laura Gomez. Professor Gomez, my first question is for you. More than 25 years ago, former Governor Pete Wilson endorsed Proposition 187, which made unauthorized immigrants ineligible to receive public benefits. How did that 1994 ballot initiative empower Latinos to become civically engaged?
Well, thank you for that question, Kim, and thank you to the Sacramento Bee for putting this panel together and allowing this group of us to come together. I've enjoyed the conversation. So I remember back in 1994 when we were getting ready to vote on Prop 187, and I remember being yelled at. A driver yelled at me, go back to your country. And this despite that, you know, I'm 3rd generation Mexican American on my mother's side, and, you know, maybe 15th generation New Mexican, growing up in New Mexico on my dad's side. It was a very bitter fight, and there was so much hatred of of immigrants and those assumed to be immigrants. It reminds me of what's happening now at the national level. But, and maybe Luis will have something to say about this, but it was really, I think, the death knell for the Republican Party in California, to the extent that political scientists actually talk about the Prop 187 effect, which is the fact that so many voters were agitated and up in arms, and the protest, especially of younger people who became radicalized. One of them is Kevin De Leon, former president pro tem of the California Senate and soon to be a city councilor in Los Angeles, who says he was inspired by the fight to seek to protect immigrants at that time.
Thank you. And Mr. Alvarado, you co-founded Grow Elect, an organization that helps elect Latino Republicans into office. What prompted you to start that organization 8 years ago?
Well, I had worked in Meg Whitman's campaign, and I noticed in talking to Republican elected officials in municipal seats that they were afraid to call themselves out Republicans because they felt that they did not have the backing of the Republican Party. And that, along with a conversation I had with Reince Previous, at the time chair of the RNC in Washington, D.C., we had a conversation on when they put together the autopsy report, you may remember, was how do we actually expand the Big Tent strategy for the Republican Party and help get Latinos back into the Republican Party that were once big supporters of Ronald Reagan. And the conversation was, well, we need to understand that we have to get in the trenches. We can't have, Latino outreach in Newport Beach and cocktail parties because that's not where Latinos work. And we needed to ensure that we had Latinos who actually believed what the conservative values of the party at that time really were important to ensure that they would be in positions of government so they can serve the communities, which Latinos are actually very conservative, but not aligned with the Republican Party. And I wanted to build a bridge to that connection. So we seeked out leaders in their communities who were well respected, and we gave them basic campaign tools so they would be animated enough to feel confident to run for office. And once they were running for office, we gave them basic fundamental campaign tools so they can communicate with the electorate. And then after that, once they were elected, we can help them understand their role as leaders in the community so they can serve. And then eventually, potentially, they can have the opportunity to catapult their careers into maybe state legislations or congressional offices. And that's basically what it was. At the time, I really felt that there was a connection between many Latinos, especially here in California, to be able to work in conjunction with a party, the Republican Party at the time, who didn't understand how to actually bridge that community together. And yes, 187 did great damage to our community. I was quite upset about it myself. And I had conversations with consultants who were part of the decision making. And for those consultants, they were looking at the long-term effects. Like most consultants think in very cyclical ways. For us, it's we want 50+1 for this election cycle, and we don't really care about the effects of what's going to happen afterwards. So nobody had the foresight to think that this was going to be a catalyst that the Democrats also used very effectively in creating a platform to how they were going to get Latinos to move over to the Democratic side.
Thank you. And Mr. Alvarado, as a follow-up question, you said that Ronald Reagan had Latino support. What do you think happened between the 1980s and the disconnection between the Republican Party and Latinos in California?
Nationalistic sentiment really started to grow, which now has flourished to its full potential in 2020, unfortunately, for the Republican Party. If you don't know, I'm a Republican. I've been a Republican my entire life. And now I am a member of an organization called the Lincoln Project, which is many Republicans who feel that Donald Trump does not represent Republicanism as we known it for many, many decades. And we have stepped aside from the Republican Party and actually are advocating for the promotion of Joe Biden, which is a phenomenon that I never thought in my life I would ever see. But that is basically a sense that the party had failed at that original direction of trying to bring people of color, not just Latinos, but people in color in general, into the party so they can actually realize that the party needed to grow and not to be reduced. Because the demographic changes that Cindy has done so well to illustrate, the Latino communities are growing in this country, and we have to have a bridge to be part of the leadership so we can take over and make sure that the country remains strong and representative, not just in government, but in the corporate boardrooms, and in the blue-collar leadership representation. So we feel that we have ownership and stakeholder of this country.
Thank you. And Professor Gomez, while researching this project, I noticed the term Chicano was heavily used among Latino politicians before they embraced the term Latino. Why did that shift occur?
That's a fascinating question, one that I'm very interested in. In fact, the Los Angeles Times actually has a policy that they don't use the word Chicano. They will only use the word Latino, even when, you know, I've written op-eds and I'm specifically trying to use the word Chicano. So politicians who came of age in the 1970s, Mexican-American politicians often used the word Chicano, which was politicized as a more radical term, and as a kind of a countercultural and less of a assimilationist term. And so you have politicians that came out of that era like Gil Cedillo and Antonio Villaraigosa, and who were involved in those Chicano movement politics in Southern California. And so they used that term. But after the 1980 census, at the national level, that was the first time that the census counted Latinos, meaning Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cuban Americans at that time. Those were the vast majority of Latinos. It kind of produced this impetus to talk about what's called a pan-Latino or pan-Hispanic term, which was going beyond just your group. I think that in California, Latino is a more popular term, but in other parts of the country, it's Hispanic, right? So you kind of saw this transition, I think, on the part of those politicians as they were becoming more mainstream, maybe even as they were getting older and sort of, you know, coming to a different stage in their life, wanting to use terminology that was both perhaps less confrontational and also put them in touch with a broader population.
Thank you. And Mr. Alvarado, you've spent years recruiting conservative candidates of color. Now you're in the Lincoln Project. What do you see in the future for Latino Republicans?
Well, they're going to have to make a choice, right? Because Republicans, as it stands right now, you look at the polling for the presidential election, not just for the office of the president, but other down ballot races. Truly, the Republican Party is falling apart. There is no way to entice, and I don't see any way to entice candidates to continue to be considering running for any office under the flagship of being a Republican. There's going to be a reckoning soon after this election, and there's going to have to be serious conversations like we had when we had the autopsy report. The question is, who's going to stand in and be the leader of the party, right? Is it going to be the Ted Cruz's, or is it going to be the more moderates who are now being chastised for not supporting Donald Trump? So it may have to be burned down to the ground and rebuilt from the ground up, or we're going to see a type of revitalization. Because if they stay the course, basically the party would not have a voice in the leadership of this country or the state for that matter, which brings a great danger, because if you have a one party that has total domination, in this case the Democratic Party, as we see with the polling today, then the infighting is going to be inside the Democratic Party, and the nation would have to be pulled too much to the left that it's not going to be effective. It's going to be still creating volatility among the nation, and we won't have the ability to have a conversation and move forward on the issues that truly the nation needs to move forward, not just in the country, but in the world economy. You know, I remember the days when we used to talk about infrastructure week, you know, building bridges and building roads and helping industries be successful. And those conversations have turned into ideological warfare. And if we don't find a way to ensure that there is some voice that represents the Republican Party as the party of conservatism, then we're going to continue to have these issues of separation in our nation. So it's very important to still have a voice for those ideologies so they don't feel that they're being chastised.
And Professor Gomez, in your new book, Inventing Latinos, a New Story of American Racism, you talk about the decades-long efforts it took to include Latinos in the census. Can you talk about the significance of the 2020 census count for Latino communities?
Yes, I'd love to do that, Kim. So I want to talk about 3 ways in which I believe the Trump administration has and is still trying to depress the Latino count. And these are, if he succeeds, this will have devastating impact on California because of the funding that's determined by census number, and because of the reapportionment process for Congress as well as at the state legislative level. So the first thing to say is that the Trump administration was enjoined just last Friday by a judge, a federal court judge, who said that they were essentially lying about trying to move the deadline, which had been extended because of COVID, up by a fair amount. And so the judge enjoined them, and she's actually got a hearing. Judge Lucy Koh from San Francisco has a hearing today to decide whether or not to hold the Trump administration in contempt because of the behavior that they've been continuing to engage in even after her injunction on Friday. The second thing I was going to mention is the citizenship question, right, which we know more about, which so Trump wanted to add a citizenship question, which, as Senator DURAZO said, that was not only going to affect undocumented immigrants who would be deterred, but also, mixed status families, because our families aren't just, we're not just undocumented or just documented, right? There's all those lines that are crossed. But the Supreme Court stopped him in summer of 2018 from doing that. And the third thing regarding the 2020 census that the Trump administration did is, even before the citizenship question, they refused the census's recommendation to, instead of having the Hispanic ethnicity question, to move that Latino Hispanic count into the race question. And so let me just give you an illustration of how this matters. When you look at the Latino population nationwide, it's about 20% right now. When you look at California's Latino population, it's 34%. You look at LA County's population, it's 45%. But when you look at the 45% of Latinos in LA County, because they still have to answer a separate race question, while 21% of them say that they're white on the census, another 24% of them say that they're, while half of them say that they're white, another 55% of them say that they're other race. And so when we get the 2020 census results, the second largest racial group in the United States is going to be other. And that's going to be largely, overwhelmingly, like 98.5% Latino.
Thank you. And we have a reader question from Thais Armenta of Sacramento County for each of you. Can you clarify your position on equality versus diversity? Mr. Alvarado, will you go first?
Quality versus diversity?
Yes.
Well, one of the issues that I have is when we elect Latinos to office who are not qualified or were voted in just because they have a Latino last name. I'm going to use case in point, the sheriff of Los Angeles County, who was voted in because he has a Latino last name. And the professor just mentioned, we have a giant Latino population in Los Angeles County, but wasn't prepared. And now the Latino community is suffering because this sheriff is losing control of his own department. So I see this so often. I see Latinos that were voted in and were not prepared and now become headlines in their local communities because of malfeasance as they exercise their oath of office. And that becomes something that deters or diminishes the pride of the Latino community electing their own members to govern. So one of the things that I advocate for is to make sure that the Latinos actually take the time to understand the process. We are not used as just, the last second, try to point out who the enemy of the community is, to try to enrage them and get them to vote over to X over Y, and become just people that are used for very specific issues or advocacy. So as a Latino community, we have to become part of the process of the conversation. And that's where I see that we have a challenge, not just in California and Los Angeles, but throughout the state. So we have to make sure that we find the correct Latinos that are actually going to be successful on the seats that they're seeking, so they themselves become a point of light to entice other Latinos or the next generation to be part of the political process.
Thank you, Mr. Alvarado. And Professor Gomez, would you like to respond?
Kim, was the question quality or equality?
Equality versus diversity.
Okay, so I thought it was equality. So I think this is a great question because we often think, for example, Governor Newsom just signed in a new law requiring corporate boards to have a certain percentage of diversity members. And I would say that's diversity, but it's not equality, because equality would be about corporate America really being openly, being evenly distributed. I don't think that people in the African American or Latino community are any less able to be good business people, but they haven't had the human capital and the financial capital to be able to compete. So we don't have equality, but in some sense, this is a good bill and it will increase diversity, but I don't know that it's going to increase equality at all.
I second that motion.
Well, that wraps up our last segment of the event. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to our panelists for being part of this engaging conversation. This project would not have been possible without the generous support of the Solutions Journalism Network, and we can't do this without our subscribers. The more subscribers who invest in local journalism, the more news we can deliver to our communities. Subscribe at sacbee.com/subscribe, and please follow the Bee's Capitol Bureau team on Facebook and Twitter. You could follow us on facebook.com/Capitol Alert. Have a great day.